Hey there YouTube, welcome to the Arctic Reptile Ranch. In a previous video, I set up this paludarium. It's an Exoterra 12 by 12 by 24 paludarium. Well, today I'm going to be setting up this Exoterra 18 by 18 by 36 paludarium. If you enjoyed my last build and want to see what I do with this one, stick around. As you can see, just like in my previous video, I have everything, for the most part, that I'm going to be using in this build laid out on this table. It's a slightly larger table because I have a slightly larger build to do. Starting at the bottom, we're going to be using a substrate that a lot of reptile enthusiasts probably aren't very familiar with. There's an entirely different genre of cage builds that revolves around actual aquatic building, and it's called aquascaping. So this type of planting soil is used very often in aquascaping. It's very nutrient rich and I believe has fertilizers built into it. So we're going to use this nice black soil as the base level substrate. Next, as a hardscape, I'm going to be using this strata rock. I like this rock because the lines in it kind of reminds me of petrified wood, and that's going to match very well with any of the wood that I use in the non-aquatic part. Also, this will contrast very well against the black soil, and the roughage in here, the rough surface, will give somewhere for plants to grip as they grow. Initially, I'm just going to put in some dwarf hair grass that I have here. Now, this doesn't look like a lot, but I can probably get about a dozen little plantable parts out of this. And I've got a pretty nice sized Java fern right here that, again, I can probably pull apart and get multiples out of. Additionally, some of the plants that are being watered right now, like these Amazon swords and some of my micranthium back here, those are in an emerged state right now, but they can be cut and submerged and grow perfectly well underwater. If I find it to be too barren initially, I can go ahead and make some clippings and root them and let them grow. In addition to the nutrient-rich soil to help the plants grow, I've got a CO2 disc here that is fed by my CO2 reactor. It looks just like a fire extinguisher. However, I have to unscrew that. I put in citric acid powder, and then I put in some baking soda, add water, and the reaction creates CO2 gas. It's the exact same thing as when you were a kid in elementary school. You made your little clay volcano, you put some baking soda in there, and then poured vinegar on top of it, and it came bubbling out. Well, I'm not really looking for a lava exactly, but the gas bubbles is what I'm creating here, and that's what is feeding CO2 into the aquatic parts of all of my enclosures here. I'm going to be using the same paludarium platform and aquarium paludarium filter as my previous build, but these are the next size up. Something I didn't mention in the last video that I really should have is there's two reasons that I like to use this particular filter. The first reason, of course, is I think I did mention it just snaps open and you can take the cartridge out and reinstall the cartridge without having to jiggle too much stuff around and pull the whole thing out of the water. That is insanely convenient for anybody who's ever had a turtle tank or a fish tank with a submerged filter. You know how much of a pain in the butt it can be to change them out. So that's one really cool feature. Another feature that somebody solved over there at ZoomEd was the length of the power cord. This power cord is almost 10 feet long. It's 9.8 feet, so pretty close. This paludarium is 3 feet tall. Your typical power cord is only 4 or 6 feet long. Let's say 6 feet. Well, then that means I have to have the power station right next to this. With 10 feet, I've got more than enough to go up, down, and plug into the power boxes that I have in the back of here. So that is a great feature that I really, really appreciate. ZoomEd, whoever's over there designing stuff, great job. I did learn in my last build that this paludarium platform, because it's solid, does make it pretty dark in the water area, so I put an LED light in there. I bought the exact same light, but in a larger length, more suited to this build. And you can see on the remote control, this has 15 different colors and white. So if I'm feeling kind of weird, I'll just turn it purple or blue or something. But for the most part, I just keep the light on white. I will sometimes turn it red at nighttime because it makes it a little bit better. This is my bedroom where I sleep. But also that red light is really good for photosynthesis. So until I end up putting fish and anything in here, at nighttime adding a little bit of red light, it's not harming anything, and it's only benefiting the plants that are growing in here. And just like my other builds, I've drilled through this and I've put a drain valve on here. And this drain valve concept has worked great on all of these. I have these automatically draining into a container, and these ones I drain as necessary. You saw that misting storm went off for about the last probably 3 minutes. Well, that adds a lot of water. And these things, I'm a gallon down right now, and this will probably be filled up in about a day or two. So I need to have these valves on here to keep that water level from getting too high and overflowing. And they work great. Now that we have the water part covered, let's talk about what's going to happen above the water line. So from here up, the top 24 inches of the enclosure. I really like the backgrounds that Exoterra made for these. This is the rainforest background, I think is what it's called, maybe. They made it for this one, and I'm sure there's other sizes that have that. But as much as I love that, I'm not going to be using it. I'm going to take that entire piece of foam out, and I'm going to be making my own background using this waterfall foam. This is just like the yellow great stuff foam. It puffs out, it expands the same way. It does, I learned. It takes a little bit longer to set, but I know that now. But it creates the same texture that kind of resembles the way cork bark is. Once it's cured to a good point, I'm going to take a knife and rough it up. At that point, I'm going to take this black silicone. I'm going to squirt it all over the foam, and then I'll put on gloves. I'll rub it in to try to get a nice even coat across the top of it. At that point, I'm going to put on this Reptile. So I'm going to have the tank laid down with this on top of it, and then just dump on the Reptile. Get as much of it on there as I can. Just really pack it in there. I've got plenty of gloves to do that with, so I don't get it all over my hands. And what that's going to do is to give a good soil layer to the vertical portion. So as my plants start to grow upwards into the soil portion, they'll have stuff to root into and to get nutrients from. And because I've gone ahead and roughed up the foam, that also is going to give them little nooks and crannies for the roots to grab onto and hold on, root, and continue to grow upwards. Just like my previous build, I plan to make different levels to put the ABG into. And once again, I'm going to be putting in the gravel that has the active bacteria in it as a drainage layer and also a good nutrient starter. I do need to tell you something about that gravel. I should have known better, but I didn't. It turns out that when you don't wear gloves while you're using that gravel and snack while you're making your paludarium, the end result can be a bacterial infection in your lower digestive tract. Yeah, that bacteria and the human digestive system do not get along. So in 3 days, I lost about 8 pounds. That's kind of a win. But it was a horrible, miserable 3 days. So please, if you go out and get this stuff and you use it for yourself, either in an aquarium or in a paludarium style like I've done, wear gloves or scrub your hands before putting them anywhere near your mouth. Enough said about that. I don't want to think about it anymore. It was very rough. Like I said though, for the various platforms, I will be using Josh's Frogs ABG again, and within that, these are the plants that I'll be using. This is a Josh's Frogs 18 cube kit. It comes with 3 leafy potted plants, 2 ferns, 2 vining type plants, and 3 bromeliads. 1 striped one and 2 green ones is what this one came with. So this is what I'm going to be using for the top 24 inches. Now, you hear 18 cube, I've got 24 inches. Something that I learned a long time ago when I was making enclosures for dart frogs, when you go ahead and pack the enclosure with a lot of plants right off the bat, it doesn't work out very well because the plants are competing for space. So sometimes they can actively kill one another, or they're just going to outcompete one another to get moisture out of the soil, and you end up with dead brown plants over here and then barren areas that take a few months to grow in. So what I learned from that is to just plant it a little bit more sparsely than you think you need, add moss to the open spaces, and within 2 to 3 months your plants will fill in those open spaces. You're giving your plants room to expand and grow on their own. And as you can see from this enclosure right here that I set up last time, you know, I didn't fill this up with the plants. I put them here and there, but you can see this thing looks great. Let me open the doors so you can see it a little bit better. But inside here is looking great. I've got the moss is already growing up on the wood. It's growing down from the wood. These baby tears are just growing down like crazy. This is doing very, very well. And it's been about a month since I've set this up. So in addition to the plants, I need to add some solid fixtures to hardscape the upper areas, the non-aquatic. So I've got plenty of cork tubes left, and I'm going to try some different things with these maybe. I've got this great piece of grapevine. I'm going to use this Galapagos Reptile gear bark with moss all over it. I'm going to find somewhere to put that in there. And I've got other pieces of cork down here that I might incorporate. I might incorporate other pieces of wood that I have down here. I've got a pretty nice collection of driftwood and pieces. I want to go ahead and probably this time use the vines here. You know, I've got an Exoterra vine right here. I've got a Galapagos Reptile gear vine. And I've got one that I got from Amazon. I'm probably going to braid those together and find somewhere for them inside the enclosure. Haven't quite decided where yet, but I'd like to. Continuing to move upwards in the enclosure, I'll be adding this in there. This is your standard Miss King double nozzle, but I've taken it apart and Frankensteined it to make it two different vertical levels. That way, the understory is getting sprayed at the same time as the top, because what I've noticed in some of my other enclosures is the top gets a lot of water and the bottom only really gets some misting. It doesn't really get soaked the way I want it to during the longer misting sessions. And then of course, I'll be using one of these again, just like on every other enclosure that I have in here. It's a computer exhaust fan. This is what's going to ensure that I have good airflow coming through there so that the humid air that's in there doesn't stagnate. It doesn't encourage excessive mold growth. And again, these are super easy to plug in. It's a USB port. You plug it into a phone charger and it doesn't draw very much power. And these are, I want to say they're like $9 on Amazon. They're super inexpensive. Moving upwards, still even more, I plan to use this Reptisun LED UVB just like I have on all the other enclosures. And there's already that bright light on it, and I may use both of them. If I find that this 14-inch isn't enough to illuminate that entire enclosure from top to bottom, yeah, I might add an additional light. And you know, I've just got other products here that I might try to find places for. Having shown you the various components that are going to go into making this paludarium, it's time to get to work. I begin this build by installing ZoomEd's large paludarium platform. What I learned from my last build is that the legs are kind of bulky and they take up a lot of space, which makes it difficult when you're planting stuff and trying to get accessories underneath. So this time, I just used foam to secure it to the sides, and you can see that along with the back, I put it on the lip. And while I have the black foam handy, I go ahead and start building up the background. Vertical lines roughly simulate bark on a tree. I now begin adding somewhat solid pieces into the wet foam, and these pieces will serve as areas for the plants to grow in, to grip onto, and eventually when I add animals to this enclosure, these will be the land areas for them to traverse. And you can see, I learned my lesson from my last build, have the tape ready. We now jump ahead a few hours. I've given the foam about 3 hours to dry. And what I'm doing at this point is using a drywall knife to start carving off excess pieces of foam, and I'm roughing up the surface layer of foam so that the silicone and the substrate that I put back there will have somewhere to adhere to. I'm making sure to spread out the silicone really good through all the little nooks and crannies so that the substrate will also get into those and give plant roots somewhere to go. And here, just as simple as that, you dump the substrate on top of the silicone rub it in, pat it in, and we let it sit overnight. For this next part of the build, I've transitioned to a split screen. You can see I'm still using one camera behind me, but I've put another camera on the side so you can get a closer view. And eventually we're going to switch to only the side camera view. It shows what I'm doing in better detail. Before putting in the primary aquatic substrate, I added those little rocks around the valve so that it would drain better. And here I'm using aqua soil, the tropical style, as my main substrate. When I was placing these rocks, which is called the hardscape, I was trying to make it look like an actual tree that had fallen and kind of was going in one single line. Adding substrate around the edges gives it the illusion that it's been there for a long time. Here, I'm using a paintbrush to remove the substrate from the tops of my hardscape, again to give it that worn-in look. And once I'm finished with that, as you can see, I begin to place the aquatic plants into the substrate using tweezers designed for aquascaping. I'm installing Zoomed's Paludarium filter designed for the larger size paludariums. Initially, I installed this tube to make a dripping back wall, but the flow rate wasn't good enough to allow the water to filter efficiently. So as of right now, that filter is acting just like a normal underwater filter, circulating the water very well and keeping it crystal clear. Luckily, I didn't need that dripping back wall. The Mist King nozzles that I'm using in there do more than an efficient job and keep that back wall nice and moist for all the plants growing on it. As you can see, I did make some effort to incorporate areas to hide wires and tubes and lines, but I wasn't overly concerned with that because I knew once all the plants grew in, you wouldn't notice them. I also took some of the hardscaping, smashed it up with a hammer so that I could put little chips here and there, kind of like if a petrified log had fallen in, it's going to break into not just large chunks, but tiny chunks as well. You'll see that I'm wearing gloves once again, and that's because I'm about to add that bacteria-rich gravel, and I learned my lesson from the first time. I do not want another miserable 3 days with a bacterial infection of my lower gastrointestinal tract. I cannot overemphasize how miserable of a 3 days that was. With that bacteria-rich gravel in place, I now begin to add my primary substrate, which is ABG that I purchased from Josh's Frogs. I've used this in a lot of wet environments, and this stuff lasts a really long time. You'll see that I'm adding some of the hardscaping stones to the land area. This is meant to tie in the aquatic portion and the land portion, add a sense of continuity to the overall aesthetic of this particular build. In addition to the live bacteria in the gravel, I opted to use Josh's Frog's bioactive boosting powder. Simply put, it's a substrate additive designed to give the microfauna that I'll be putting in here a jump start. Just like in my last paludarium build, you'll see me using tools that are designed for aquascaping. Turns out they work equally as well for micro gardening. Now it's time for me to start putting the plants in. As you can see, I'm putting rocks in front of some. That's mostly for decoration, but it's also good if I were to have put something in here kind of early on. It would prevent a lizard or any other small creature from moving the plants around and pulling the roots out before they have a good chance to really set themselves. Now that I'm done with most of the plants, I'm putting in sheet moss that I've been cultivating for the last few months prior to this build. Within that sheet moss are all the microfauna that I wanted to add to this enclosure. The roly-polies, the dwarf white isopods, springtails, little red worms, all kinds of stuff. In this shot, you can see that as I'm about to start adding water, some of the isopods that were transplanted with the moss are already out and about exploring their new home. While the aquatic portion is filling up, now is a good time to add water to the top areas to give those a thorough soaking for the roots. Yep, it turns the water super murky and dirty, but that's what the filter's for. So by the next day, the water was clear as can be. My final bit of construction in this paludarium build is taking a piece of grapevine and using it to act as a bridge to connect the three land pieces. And this will allow the large isopods, small isopods, springtails, and any larger animals that I happen to put in here to easily traverse between the three primary land platforms. And now, thanks to my magical ability to procrastinate, we can have a look at this paludarium 5 months after the initial build. You can see that most of the plants are doing extremely well. I've added a pothos in here, but look at how well nearly everything is doing. The spider plant, some of it's doing well, some of it's not doing as well, but let's see. Bromeliad is growing great right there. I've got this moss, this Christmas moss right here, that just, it's exploding, growing great. And then we come down here. Underwater isn't growing quite as well as I'd hoped, but it's still doing pretty well. A lot of the plants are still green in there. There's nothing living in this one just yet because I haven't decided what I want to put in here. But when I'm finally ready to, you can see that this enclosure is definitely ready for something tropical or semi-aquatic. Maybe both.